Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you are the way Americans are increasingly embracing the idea of vaccine mandates, the development of a bacterium that allows researchers to see how they fix damaged DNA in almost real time, the continuing saga of the ISS, and Ingenuity, both of NASA's major space projects at the moment. An interesting development in media bias monitoring with the publishing of the most recent version of a bias map. These and other news items are covered in the timestamps given in the description box below. Let's start with the vaccine mandates. These are gaining more general attention, both from the media and from the government, with Pfizer and possibly other drug manufacturers getting full approval for their CCP virus vaccines. These become legally enforceable mandates once that happens. Mandates would be one way to ensure that Americans would have used the vaccine and thereby implemented one of the best public health measures to prevent the spread or at least reduce the impact of the CCP virus. At least according to the most recent Gallup poll on this topic, more Americans are looking at embracing it when it comes to traveling on a plane, staying in a hotel, or dining in restaurants. These are three very, very good ways to stop the spread. An aeroplane is a confined space, one in which people will breathe in recirculated air for quite some time. Hotels are similar. They're a shared space with many people moving in and out. Dining in a restaurant requires you not wear a mask, and if you are communicating or otherwise releasing aerosols, they can travel to other tables quite easily. The largest shift in embracing vaccine mandates has been for those who are going to eat in a restaurant. It went from 40% to 53% over a period of 4 months. There are admittedly significantly smaller jumps in the other categories, but they all show a general trend upwards. Considering how long the CCP virus outbreak has been going on, this is probably more a sign of people getting sick of things and trying to find any way to speed the solution along. Unfortunately, there does appear to be a political bias in regards to this. Democrats overwhelmingly support a mandate. Republicans only barely do so. Unsurprisingly, the undecided or independents have an almost exactly equal split. Among the many reasons touted by various groups, organizations, and individuals for why a vaccine mandate isn't right is the concept that it's an unproven, untested, and unreliable treatment. This is a load of bunk. Even if we start looking at the possible adverse events related to vaccines for the CCP virus, we're getting a very different picture. One recently published paper looked at the nearly 12 million doses of vaccines, specifically Pfizer and Moderna, that were given out to 6.2 million people. Understand, adverse events ranges from everything as extreme as death, all the way down to simply having a sore arm after getting an injection. That's a huge range of events. Of the listed adverse events, 23 were considered serious. When you look at these statistically, there is almost no cause for concern. Among the many reasons why the researchers could not find any relationship between vaccines and serious adverse events is going to include things like incredibly wide confidence intervals. These are going to range from negative values through to positive values, something you shouldn't really be seeing. The fact that there was such a low incidence of many adverse events that even if you were trying to figure out whether or not they had a relationship, you couldn't really say that. We're talking along the lines of 7 or so incidents per 1,000,000 doses given out. There is also going to be likely some degree of pushback to this, something to the effect of, well, we just don't know the long-term consequences. The reality is this study looked at a period at nearly 1.5 months. That's more than enough time for adverse events to show up. Generally speaking, you're expected to see something within 3 weeks, 21 days. They waited 42 days, twice that interval, and still, by doubling the time frame involved, they were unable to find a pattern of adverse events to either vaccine that's out of the norm compared to anything else. Going from vaccine-related research news to bacteria and genomic-related news. There is a big interest in just how your DNA can be fixed. Generally speaking, things like cancer are caused by mutations in the DNA over time, which lead to cells growing out of control. If they're relatively benign, they're a tumor. If they begin to become a problem, they're cancer. By taking DNA and modifying them in such a way that you can track the movement of DNA parts and how they're assembled, you can begin to see just what the bacterium is doing to keep its DNA in good order. And that's what researchers from the Uppsala University in Sweden are doing. We already know that DNA is maintained by having 2 strands, one that is theoretically sound and good, and one that has been damaged. By ensuring that you copy the good strand against the damaged strand, the damaged strand should be repaired by various DNA enzymes. The researchers have then followed many thousands of bacteria, specifically E. coli, trying to find out just how and when this enzyme acts using various probes and markers. By doing this, they're able to find that the E. coli are able to not only find the break, but begin repairing it within 9 minutes. The average time was about 15 minutes. That's a relatively short period to be able to repair damage to the DNA. The idea underlying this, at least in theory, is that if you have damaged DNA as a human, you could theoretically use this technique and the methodologies behind it to develop new techniques to treat mutant DNA damage. That is, damage to your body that has led to pathogenicity. Going from bacteria to animals, and in this instance, weird Australian animals, Australian ducks are learning to swear. Yeah. Amongst the many weird animal things that could happen, this was not one we saw coming. The musk duck is a particularly common duck. What is not common about the musk duck is that they're learning through socializing. This isn't a particularly common behavior among animals. And particularly, it's very small in ducks. In fact, it's more or less unheard of before now. Last week it was lyrebirds recreating the sound of power tools. This week, it's ducks recreating the sounds of people. We're a little bit worried about what next week might bring. This week does continue to bring us more uncomfortable news about the ISS. This time, a smoke alarm is going off. Most people would take this as an indicator to leave the site as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, that's not possible. This time though, we're not surprised by where the sound has come from. It's from yet another part of the Russian side of the ISS. Only this year, they already found a leak in that particular module that was losing atmosphere to space. The Zveda module in particular is noteworthy as it's about 20 odd years old now. It was deployed in the year 2000 and so is likely coming up to a period where damage would begin to show. What is surprising this week is the continuing functionality of Ingenuity. That is NASA's helicopter currently on Mars. This was a vehicle intended to have a relatively short lifetime. Maybe 5 flights in total. That of course assumes it survives each of its flights. It's now completed 12. That means it's having a lot more success than initially anticipated, and that's a really good thing. Given that they've been able to achieve all of their engineering goals, the primary role of the little helicopter now is to start scouting the way for curiosity. By doing that, they can more effectively pick sites for it to move to and explore, and since the vehicle, in the form of Ingenuity, can travel further up and get a better eye on the surrounding terrain, then transmit those images back to Earth, NASA's better able to choose how and what it does. It's already made use of this in choosing to most likely not explore an area that was previously thought to be of some interest. Finally, we have an interesting chart created by the Adforms Media group. They've attempted to plot the bias of various organizations according to their accuracy of reporting and their political leaning. They've then gone and clustered them into different groups. You'll note in the image here, there's everything from contains inaccurate and fabricated information, particularly of note here is InfoWars, all the way up to fact reporting and being non-biased with the Associated Press and Reuters. In between these two extremes, there is scope for debate, let's say. Certainly, based on recent court decisions, the Rachel Maddow show and Fox News could arguably be moved up or down. In other cases, different people may view different organizations as being more left or right-leaning based on the current Overton window. Of course, you'll note that there is a surprising relative equity of distribution of the various organizations. Why this particular version is noteworthy is that they've now begun including web, TV, and podcast sources of information and arguably news. This is a different shift from past efforts where it's primarily focused on things like TV services. This is why you will see groups like the Ben Shapiro Show and the Young Turks showing up on it. They've included organizations like the BBC and Breitbart News and have placed them on relatively opposing sides of the political spectrum. Depending on who you ask, they may be more or less substantially oriented each way, and they also may be arguably described as containing more or less factual reporting. And this is where the chart gets interesting, primarily because if you are going to look at this, you have to ask not just about their methodology, but to a degree, how much of it, even if it is robust, is still subject to a very non-objective interpretation. Despite this, it is an interesting depiction of the current media landscape and certainly worth examining. Not only is it a reasonably well-designed and set up system, for the most part, it does also provide you with a reasonable explanation as to how they've achieved this particular chart, how they decided on it, and some examples. Although we don't expect entire clarity in how they've achieved what they've achieved, it's, as said, a good place to start and provides some interesting insight into the current media landscape. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.